There are always some ships that, for better or worse, are overlooked. The Porter-class destroyers of the United States Navy are one such example. They came between the swarm of four-stackers and the later swarm of Fletchers and Gearings. The Porters were also hampered by weight issues and compromises in their design that left them less capable than smaller ships. This is not to say they were bad ships, far from it. But between their design issues and generally less exciting service lives, they are often forgotten. That even applies to the name ship, Porter herself. And that's just Porter, not William D. Porter, like I'm sure at least a few people clicking on this are thinking of. Although I'll admit there's some level of irony in two ships named Porter, or some variation thereof, having incidents with torpedoes. In this case, Porter's end came when the destroyer was torpedoed at the Battle of Santa Cruz. This crippled Porter and forced her crew to abandon ship. Where that torpedo came from is a point of contention. One version has Porter be a very unlucky ship, one of the unluckiest in American naval history. Before that, however, let's look at the design and service history of USS Porter. This will be a bit longer on the design than usual, as this is the nameship of her class. Porter was the first of a new breed of large destroyers, a legacy of a long and drawn-out development process, one that stretched all the way back to the Great War, although it would take a winding road to final completion. The genesis of this design can be seen in the Navy's lacking cruiser force, based almost entirely around the Omaha class. Destroyer leaders could, in theory, fill a gap in the scouting force, while, as the name implies, leading the smaller destroyer flotillas. Or so the theory went. As it turned out, this wouldn't happen. First, the great cutdown in spending of the 1920s hit the Navy. They had hundreds of four-stackers and saw little need to spend limited funding on new destroyers, preferring instead to focus on maintaining what they already had, along with developing new cruisers. So, while the Great War design would linger on as a basis for future large destroyers, it went nowhere. Until, that is, the early 1930s. At this point, the Navy was looking for new destroyers. This would result in two different designs for the first generation. First off, the Farragut class, which was the blueprint for future destroyer design. Long and sleek ships armed with 5 5-inch guns and single mounts, along with quadruple torpedo tubes. This was the pattern, with variations in the number of torpedoes and main guns, that would endure through the Fletchers. The design that came along with the Farraguts, meanwhile, was the Porter class. While an outgrowth of the old destroyer leader concept, the Navy actually considered these more of a large destroyer than a destroyer leader. Friedman, in particular, makes note of this. To quote his book, "In fact, there was so little difference between leader and led that no special destroyer leader designation was ever used. Not that it stopped them from being used as flotilla leaders, mind you. They were pretty well suited to the role, no matter what the Navy said. In any case, the Porters were built with an eye towards the London Naval Treaty. That allowed 13 large destroyers of 1,850 tons. In the case of the United States, that resulted in 8 Porters and later on 5 Summers-class ships. As a result, you had the Farragut for standard destroyer design and the Porter for large destroyer design. But what did the Navy actually get out of this design? Well, at standard displacement, Porter came in at the 1,850-ton limit. This rose to around 2,660 tons at full load. That allowed for carrying a very heavy broadside for a 1930s destroyer. 8 5-inch 38 caliber guns and 4 twin mounts. However, in the interest of saving weight, those twin mounts were single-purpose affairs. So while the 5-inch 38 is legendary for its use in dual-purpose roles, the Porters, as originally designed, couldn't use them that way. These were primarily intended for surface action. It also made the ships look a bit like miniature cruisers, sporting tripod masts, 2 funnels, and gunhouses reminiscent of early American heavy cruisers. However, over the course of the Second World War, this layout would change. It varied between ships, with an interesting mix developing. For example, replacing the single-purpose mounts with dual-purpose models, including both single and twin mounts. You would also generally see one mount removed and replaced by anti-aircraft guns, even on the ships that retained their original single-purpose mount. This was to improve the firepower, but also to try and deal with a persistent topweight issue. The other offensive weaponry, alongside that variety of guns, were the torpedo tubes. The Porter class carried 2 quadruple mounts, both amidships. That made for a total broadside of 8 torpedoes. This was the same as Farragut, but Porter differed in carrying a full set of reloads for a total of 16 torpedoes. Not a common choice on American ships, and those reloads were not repeated on the Summers class. To round off the weaponry, the ships carried typical depth charge racks and an initial light anti-aircraft battery of 2 quadruple 1.1-inch mounts. This would, of course, be heavily changed over the course of their career, replaced by a range of 40mm Bofors guns and 20mm cannon. All of this could be pushed through the water at 37 knots by 50,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. And with that rounding off the long design history, let's return to service now. As largely uneventful as that service may be. That story began on December 18th, 1933. The ship that would become Porter was laid down on that day by New York Shipbuilding. Her construction would progress in the usual manner, with the destroyer launched on December 12, 1935. The fitting out process would go without incident as well. USS Porter commissioned into the United States Navy on August 25, 1936, where she would then spend the next few years on pretty quiet duty. Her shakedown cruise went off without a hitch as the destroyer worked up to join the fleet. She would, in this process, join ceremonies in Newfoundland. This was in May of 1937 and revolved around celebrating the coronation of King George VI in Britain. Upon conclusion of those ceremonies, Porter returned home, anchoring at the Washington Navy Yard, where she would, in turn, be present for a Boy Scout jamboree in June through July 1937. Nothing particularly notable to this point. This would remain the case for the remainder of her peacetime service. Not that this is terribly surprising, as most ships had little to do in this period. In Porter's case, she would depart the Atlantic in August 1937 to transit the Panama Canal and shift to the Pacific Ocean. There she would remain, based out of the West Coast. This period of her life mostly focused on training and patrol duty, with the annual fleet problems serving as a break from the monotony. At least through 1940, when the last fleet problem was carried out. Because, as the global situation worsened, 1941 would not see one of those exercises. Instead, Porter joined the fleet as preparations for war with Japan became more and more necessary. It was clear that something was going to happen, although it was still an open question what it would actually entail. As it turned out, that was the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Porter narrowly avoided this attack as she had departed the harbor on December 5th as part of USS Lexington's escort on the mission to reinforce Midway. Because of this, Porter went undamaged. She would patrol the waters around Hawaii in the aftermath of the attack to keep an eye out for any follow-up. But, in the lack of any Japanese action, the destroyer was eventually reassigned, specifically to escort a convoy to the West Coast in late March 1942. Porter would remain off the West Coast for the next 4 months. She only returned to Hawaii in the middle of August, at which point the ship remained in the general Hawaiian area once more. It was only on October 16, 1942, that Porter was finally sent to the front. She joined Task Force 16, sailing for the Solomon Islands. This would be Porter's one and only combat mission, as it turned out. Because, shortly after arriving, the destroyer was thrown into battle. On October 26, 1942, the Battle of Santa Cruz arrived. This was one of a series of matches between American and Japanese carriers, one mostly known for the loss of USS Hornet and the damage to USS Enterprise. It was, after all, the battle that led to Enterprise versus Japan becoming a thing. However, Hornet was not the only American loss in this action. During the battle, Porter provided escorts and anti-aircraft defense for the American task force. She performed this well and without issue at first. However, during the battle, the destroyer was hit. Sources will differ on the exact chain of events, with some saying she had slowed down to pick up a downed aircrew, and other sources making no mention of that happening. Regardless, Porter was hit by a torpedo at this point. That torpedo has become something of a sticking point in Porter's career. There are two competing theories in this regard. For enemy action, there's the claim the submarine I-21 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes, with one of them slamming into Porter, crippling the destroyer. A different source by Richard Frank states that Japanese records don't support this. He made the argument it was a torpedo from a crashed Avenger that hit the ship. As the argument goes, the Avenger had not used its torpedo, and as the crew ditched, the plane slammed into the water, where the torpedo knocked loose and activated, and then promptly slammed into USS Porter. Both arguments have their own merits, but we'll probably never know for sure. Japanese records are a mess, so it would be very difficult to confirm the I-21 theory. And while I can certainly believe American torpedoes were finicky enough to do something like this, well, it would take some astoundingly poor luck for a plane crash to activate a torpedo and send it crashing into a friendly destroyer. I'm not going to make a claim one way or the other. There's not enough evidence. Either way, Porter would be scuttled by USS Shaw after she picked up the destroyer's crew. Her story thus came to an end on October 26, 1942, with only one battle star in action to her name. Not the luckiest ship out there, to be sure. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.